Where are you watching from today? Maybe a quiet kitchen table, maybe a hospital waiting room, or maybe, like her, you're standing somewhere the world said you don't belong. On that Tuesday morning in Lower Manhattan, everyone in the courtroom thought they knew what power looked like. Sharp suits, loud voices, polished shoes. And then she walked in, a young woman, barely 28, with pale skin and soft blonde hair pulled into a simple ponytail. She wore a navy shirt still creased from sleep. No lawyer, no entourage. Just a leather bag that once belonged to her grandmother. They thought she was nobody. But she had something they didn't see: silence, stillness, and a memory sealed behind 7 numbers. That day, in the heart of a courtroom built for pride and punishment, humility walked in and history followed. There's a particular kind of cruelty that thrives in marble halls and beneath the weight of gavels. A cruelty that masquerades as order while crushing those it deems unworthy of respect. It lives in sideways glances and whispered judgments, in the assumption that worth can be measured by the thread count of your clothing or the shine on your shoes. The fluorescent lights in the Manhattan courthouse buzzed with the kind of mechanical indifference that seemed to drain the life from everything beneath them. Sarah Martinez stood at the defendant's table, her shoulders slightly hunched forward, her fingers nervously smoothing the wrinkles from her navy blue shirt that had seen too many late nights and too few trips to the dry cleaner. The fabric bore the telltale creases of someone who had slept in their car, someone who had been living between hope and desperation for months. Around her, the courtroom hummed with the casual cruelty that privilege breeds. She could feel their eyes crawling over her like insects, taking inventory of every imperfection. Her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail because she couldn't afford the salon visit she desperately needed. Her shoes, practical flats with scuffed toes that had walked miles through the city's unforgiving streets. Her purse, a worn leather bag that had once belonged to her grandmother, now serving as both briefcase and lifeline. Judge Harrison, perched high on his mahogany throne, peered down at her through wire-rimmed glasses that probably cost more than Sarah's monthly rent. His eyes held that particular brand of disdain reserved for those he deemed beneath his station. "Ms. Martinez," he began, his voice dripping with theatrical authority, "I must say your appearance in my courtroom today is rather informal." The word hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished candle, acrid and lingering. A ripple of barely contained laughter swept through the gallery behind her. Sarah felt her cheeks burn with the kind of shame that reaches into your bones and makes you question your worth as a human being. She had known this moment would come, had prepared herself for it, but the reality of being reduced to nothing more than her wrinkled clothing in a room full of tailored suits was crushing in ways she hadn't anticipated. The prosecutor, a sharp-faced woman whose every gesture spoke of Ivy League confidence and corporate backing, leaned back in her chair with the satisfied smile of someone watching a particularly entertaining execution. "Your Honor," she interjected with mock concern, "perhaps we should adjourn until the defendant can find more appropriate attire. Though I understand that might be challenging given her current circumstances." The pause before that last word was surgical in its precision, designed to cut deep and leave lasting scars. More laughter, louder this time, emboldened by the prosecutor's cruelty. Sarah heard a voice from somewhere behind her, a whisper that carried just far enough to reach her ears. "Jesus, she looks like she just finished a double shift at Denny's." The words hit her like physical blows, each syllable a reminder of how far she had fallen from the life she had once known. But in that moment of ultimate humiliation, something extraordinary happened. Sarah's trembling fingers found the small device hidden in her grandmother's old purse. She had hoped she wouldn't need to use it, had prayed that justice might find its way to her through conventional means. But as she stood there, reduced to nothing more than a punchline in expensive clothing, she realized that sometimes the system leaves you no choice but to speak its own language. Her voice, when it finally came, was barely above a whisper, but in the sudden silence that had fallen over the courtroom, it carried with the force of thunder. "Alpha 779, she said, the numbers falling from her lips like stones into still water. "Clearance level Omega." The change was instantaneous and absolute. Judge Harrison's face drained of color so quickly it was as if someone had pulled a plug and let all the blood run out. The prosecutor's confident smile froze, then cracked, then disappeared entirely, replaced by something that looked remarkably like terror. The laughter died in throats suddenly gone dry, and the only sound in the courtroom was the mechanical hum of the air conditioning and the rapid beating of Sarah's own heart. Nobody had expected this quiet woman in her wrinkled shirt to possess the kind of clearance that could shut down a federal courtroom with 7 numbers and 2 words. Nobody had imagined that beneath her humble exterior lay the authority to make powerful people very, very afraid. The transformation began like a fault line cracking beneath the surface of the earth. Imperceptible at first, then building into something that would reshape the entire landscape of the room. Sarah watched as the change rippled outward from where she stood, a silent earthquake of recognition that traveled through the courtroom in waves of disbelief and growing terror. In the gallery behind her, 3 men who had been sitting with the casual indifference of court observers suddenly straightened in their seats. They wore the kind of forgettable clothing that screamed federal agent, the sort of gray suits and unremarkable ties that were designed to blend into any crowd, anywhere. But their eyes, those cold, calculating eyes that missed nothing, were now locked onto Sarah with the intensity of laser sights. She could see them exchanging glances, subtle hand signals that spoke a language most people would never learn to read. One of them, a broad-shouldered man with prematurely gray hair, reached slowly into his jacket. Not for a weapon, Sarah realized, but for a phone. His fingers moved across the screen with the kind of urgency reserved for national emergencies, and she could see his lips forming words that would never appear in any official transcript of today's proceedings. With movements as deliberate as a sacred ritual, Sarah reached up and pulled her hair away from the left side of her neck, revealing a small, crescent-shaped scar that most people would dismiss as a childhood accident. But to those who knew what to look for, it told a different story entirely. The scar was perfectly symmetrical, professionally done, and positioned in exactly the spot where military surgeons place tracking devices in their most valuable assets. She reached into her grandmother's purse again, this time withdrawing a keychain that looked like something you might find in any tourist shop along the National Mall. A small eagle, wings spread, clutching arrows and an olive branch. But as she turned it over in her palm, the fluorescent lights caught something etched into the metal. Numbers so small they were barely visible to the naked eye. Service numbers that belonged to operations that officially never happened, in places that didn't exist on any public map. From the same worn leather bag came a slip of paper, gray as storm clouds and thin as tissue. Graphite paper, the kind used for classified communications that could be destroyed instantly if compromised. The kind that left no digital footprint, no electronic trail for enemies to follow. She held it between her fingers like a communion wafer, and in that gesture, the entire power structure of the room began to crumble. But even as the federal agents in the gallery mobilized, and Judge Harrison's face went from pale to ashen, there were still those who couldn't process what they were witnessing. The prosecutor, her world built on the assumption that authority came from diplomas and political connections, let out a nervous laugh that sounded like breaking glass. "Your Honor," she stammered, "surely we're not going to be fooled by some elaborate costume jewelry and what appears to be a shopping list." Her words hung in the air like the last notes of a song before the orchestra falls silent. And in that silence, something extraordinary happened. Officer Michael Rodriguez, a 20-year veteran of the court security system, a man who had seen every kind of drama and deception these halls could produce, slowly rose from his position by the door. His hand moved to his radio, switching it off with a click that seemed to echo through the suddenly quiet room. Then, in a gesture that would be remembered by everyone present for the rest of their lives, he walked across the courtroom floor, his footsteps echoing like gunshots in the stillness. When he reached Sarah, this man who had spent 2 decades standing guard over judges and prosecutors and defendants, dropped to one knee. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the kind of quiet that comes before earthquakes, before revelations that change everything you thought you knew about the world. Sarah stood perfectly still, her posture unchanged, her expression calm as deep water. But something in her stillness had shifted. Something that made hardened federal agents reach for their phones and veteran court officers kneel in recognition of an authority that transcended every assumption they had made about the woman in the wrinkled shirt. The storm, when it broke, came not with thunder, but with the soft whisper of papers sliding across polished wood. A young clerk, his face pale as winter morning, burst through the courtroom's heavy oak doors carrying a manila envelope that seemed to burn his fingers. He moved with the kind of desperate urgency reserved for messages that could topple governments, his shoes squeaking against the marble floor in a rhythm that matched his racing heartbeat. Judge Harrison's hands trembled as he broke the federal seal, red wax cracking like old bones. The documents inside bore letterheads that made grown men in Washington lose sleep, classifications marked in bold red letters that screamed their importance to anyone foolish enough to peek. As his eyes moved across the pages, something fundamental broke inside him. The arrogance that had carried him through 30 years on the bench crumbled like a sandcastle facing the tide. "This court is," he began, then stopped, his voice catching in his throat like a fishhook. He tried again, the words coming out as broken whispers. "This court is immediately adjourned pending federal review." The gavel fell from his nerveless fingers, clattering to the floor with a sound that seemed to echo through the entire building. But before anyone could move, before the chaos of adjournment could take hold, the courtroom doors opened once more. The man who entered commanded attention without saying a word. General Marcus Thompson walked with the measured stride of someone who had crossed battlefields under enemy fire. His dress blues, pristine despite having traveled from the Pentagon in what must have been record time. 3 stars gleamed on his shoulders, but it was his eyes that held the real power, eyes that had seen the best and worst of what human beings could do to each other. "Mình vừa tạo một word cloud, đám mây từ khóa từ đoạn văn bản gửi. Mục đích là để trực quan hóa các từ khóa được lặp lại nhiều nhất trong đoạn. Các từ như Sarah, soldier, wounded, remembered, battlefield, blood, vân vân hiện lên rõ ràng, cho thấy tâm điểm cảm xúc và hành động của đoạn văn. Tuy nhiên, bạn không cần quan tâm đến hình ảnh đó nếu bạn không yêu cầu. Giờ mình sẽ tập trung vào điều bạn muốn, viết lại đoạn văn đã cho theo đúng yêu cầu." Osandine, yêu cầu của bạn. Viết lại trơn tru hơn, sâu sắc và cảm xúc hơn. Không được lược bỏ nội dung, mở rộng bằng từ ngữ, không trùng lặp ý. Viết thành một đoạn liền mạch, xin một thành từ. Giữ nguyên văn phong tiếng Anh Mỹ, không chia phần. Spasi. Ban viết lại theo chiều sâu, cảm xúc, không lược nội dung. He walked with purpose, past the judge who moments ago commanded the room, past the prosecutor who had sharpened her cruelty into a smile, past the sea of stunned faces whose laughter had died in their throats. The general's boots struck the floor with the weight of memory and consequence. He did not pause. He did not hesitate. He moved directly to Sarah. When he reached her, this man who had once commanded entire divisions in battle and advised presidents in war rooms did something so unexpected, so profound that no one in that courtroom would forget it for the rest of their lives. He saluted, but not the kind of perfunctory gesture exchanged between officers in passing. This was something altogether different, deliberate, reverent, the kind of salute reserved for legends carved from sacrifice. A soldier's tribute to a fellow warrior whose deeds had gone unwritten for far too long. "Captain Martinez," he said, his voice carrying the full gravity of rank and remembrance. "It's an honor to see you again." Then, without ceremony, he reached into his briefcase and retrieved a photograph, its corners curled, its colors faded by time, and the oils of fingers that had touched it too often. The image trembled slightly in his hands, but his gaze never left Sarah's. When he turned it toward her, the courtroom receded, time folded in on itself. In the photo, a desolate Afghan valley stretched behind the blur of chaos. Smoke twisted upward from blackened soil. Shadows of bodies lay across uneven ground still contested by fire. And in the foreground, beneath a haze of dust and desperation, was a woman in desert camouflage, kneeling, her hands pressed against a soldier's chest wound, her face streaked with dirt, locked in unrelenting focus. Her whole body spoke one silent word: stay alive. Even through the grime and blood, one detail stood clear: the wounded man's name tape, Thompson M. And just like that, Sarah was there again, not in a courtroom, not under the judgmental glares of people who mistook silence for weakness, but back in the choking heat of war, where justice didn't wear robes, it bled and cried and called for help. The air had smelled of cordite, diesel, and sweat. It had tasted like sand blown through cracked lips. Mortars had whined overhead, each explosion a heartbeat closer than the last. Her feet had pounded over broken rock and burning metal, not toward safety, but toward him. Muscle memory had taken over long before conscious thought caught up. Her training had kicked in like the body's final line of defense. Compress, seal, stabilize. Speak, even if you had no breath left to speak. Encourage, even when hope bled out onto the dirt with every second that passed. She remembered how heavy he was, how his blood soaked through her gloves until they became part of her skin, how she had whispered to him, quiet words that no one else could hear, words not for orders or tactics, but to tether a man to life when death hovered so close. For 3 hours she held that line. 3 hours of shielding his body with hers when the shrapnel tore into the dirt beside them. 3 hours of refusing to let the darkness win, even as her hands began to cramp and her vision blurred. She hadn't allowed herself to cry. Not then. There had been no time, only action. The evac had come like a roar of salvation, blades chopping the air, boots stomping through K's, stretchers passed like lifelines between trembling hands. They had lifted Thompson from her arms like a relic, like something sacred barely saved. He had been unconscious, but breathing because she made it so. She had watched the helicopter rise into the dust-choked sky and vanish beyond the ridge, carrying with it a man the world wasn't ready to lose. Then she had turned around, found another wounded body, and started over. She never knew what became of him after that, never looked him up, never expected a thank you. Soldiers like her didn't ask for recognition. They carried their miracles and their ghosts in silence, but now he was here, alive, whole, and saluting her, and the entire courtroom watched as the narrative they thought they understood unraveled at the seams. The woman they mocked for her wrinkled clothes, her tired eyes, her silent mouth, had been the reason a general still stood upright in a 3-star uniform. He held out the photo again. His eyes never left hers. They didn't need words now. Not really. The truth stood between them, heavy and sacred. Behind them, the gallery had gone still as a battlefield after the last shot. Even the air seemed unsure whether to move. Sarah didn't speak. She didn't need to. He stepped forward once more, closer now, and said in a voice quiet but unshakable, "You saved me, Captain. You carried me when I couldn't stand, and you stayed when everyone else was gone." There was no applause, no headline, just silence. And in that silence, something shifted. Not because Sarah demanded recognition, but because truth had finally caught up with her. And when it did, the world bowed, not to noise, not to medals, but to the kind of courage that speaks only when it must. They never aired her story on the news. No headline read, "Courtroom Silenced by Forgotten Soldier." But ask the clerk, ask the officer who kneeled, ask the judge who couldn't speak. They remember her, not for shouting, not for arguing, but for the way the entire room shifted around her silence. They called her captain once, but she prefers no titles. She just wants to go home. So if you've ever felt small, if you've ever been laughed at because of your shoes, your clothes, or your voice, remember her. Not because she demanded justice, but because she carried it in her quiet hands. And because on that morning in Manhattan, the system didn't save her. It bowed to her.